Do you recognize one of the grandest ships that ever carried the British flag?
Georgic is the first big ship to be launched from a British shipyard.
She had a wonderful war record, sinking 2 enemy submarines and carrying thousands of troops in safety. They called her the Old Reliable.
The 19th century was filled with many great engineers, one of which was a man called Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He was a revolutionary engineer, and by the 1830s, Brunel had already created such marvels as the Thames Tunnel, which had collapsed, and a thing known as the Great Western Railway. But by 1835, Brunel wanted to expand his geniuses to the seas and build a brand new steamship. The Great Western's keel was laid down on the 26th of June 1836. She was to have a wooden hull and was powered by paddle wheels, but this would not be the only method of propulsion, as the Great Western would also boast sails that would serve as a backup if something happened to the paddle wheels. As for the construction process itself, it went uneventful. In fact, it went so uneventful she was launched by the 19th of July in 1837, and by 1838 she was ready for her maiden voyage. At the beginning of her career, she would prove to be a hot topic amongst the public, for all the wrong reasons, as when the Great Western was on her way to Bristol to begin her maiden voyage, she caught fire. Thankfully, she survived, but this was at a cost, as Brunel had fallen about 20 feet. I guess you could say he fell head over heels for his new ship. Huh? Are you all booing at me? Can we continue on with the video? Okay. Anyways, back to the video. As the fire led more than 50 of her passengers cancelling their bookings, but eventually she departed Bristol on the 8th of April, and when she departed on a maiden voyage, she only had 7 passengers on board. But she completed her maiden voyage without event and arrived on the 22nd of April. This would begin her relatively successful career, as many ships built around this time was based and designed off of the Great Western, one of which being Cunard's Britannia, which I've done a video on before, about 9 months ago now. Back to the Great Western, as her success led to another ship being built to accompany her. This other ship was called the SS Great Britain, but her time sailing with the Great Western Steamship Company wouldn't last, as the SS Great Britain grounded in 1845, leading to the company that owned the Great Western going bust, which then resulted in the Great Western being sold off to the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. After her previous owners went bust in 1845, the SS Great Western was sold to the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, which would lead to a new chapter in her career, which was pretty uneventful, as she sailed from Southampton to the West Indies, but she wasn't on this route for long, as after 14 voyages she was transferred to the South America route, which she would serve on from 1853 till 1855, as she was laid up in Southampton and then acquired by the British government. In 1856, she was laid up and then acquired by the British government. She was designated as Troop Ship No. 6, as she would help transport troops during the Crimean War. But she would only do this for a few months, as by August of 1856 she was sold off for scrap and broken up, ending the story of Brunel's first ship. In 1836, a person called Isambard Kingdom Brunel and his friend called Thomas Guppy formed a new company called the Great Western Steamship Company. Their first ship was called the SS Great Western, and she left on her maiden voyage in 1838 and proved to be a success, so much of a success that the Great Western Steamship Company decided that they would build a second ship. After comparing the disadvantages and advantages of wooden-hulled ships, it was decided that the Great Britain would have an iron hull, as it was stronger than wood while being lighter than wood. Not only this, but during her planning it was decided that the Great Britain would be a single screw ship instead of being a paddle wheel steamer, as screw propulsion was a lot more efficient in storms. But despite her steam engines, she'd still possess sails as a backup method of propulsion in case her engines decided to give up on life. Now, as for her interiors, for her day she was absolutely amazing. If you were in cabin class, as her dining room for example, I mean just look at those pillars. And if my memory serves correct, there was a small skylight that made it so you could see on the top deck. Though I can say, as someone who's been to her, compared to later liners, her interiors, especially her cabins, are very cramped and very warm. But anyways, like every other ship, she had a construction process. Her keel was laid down in July of 1839, and by the 19th of July 1843, the Great Britain was launched in front of hundreds of spectators. Prince Albert was originally going to watch her launch, but by the time he had finished talking and eating, he found that the SS Great Britain had already been launched. But oh well, at least there's this nice painting that I've got a poster of on my recording wall. Anyways, after being launched, it was time for the naming ceremony, which went hilariously wrong, as the person who was supposed to smash the bottle of champagne against the hull decided to give SpongeBob an alcohol addiction. And by give SpongeBob an alcohol addiction, I mean they missed the hull of the ship and chucked the bottle of unsmashed alcohol into the water. Whoops. But eventually, the name and the launch process was completed, and she just needed to have her fitting out completed. But the harbour authorities didn't make the correct adjustments quick enough, which meant, thanks to the widening of the hull, she could not fit. So for the next year, Brunel negotiated with the harbour authorities. But despite the delays, the SS Great Britain was eventually completed in 1845, ready for her maiden voyage. The Great Britain's career would begin on the 26th of July 1845, when she left on her maiden voyage. This went without event, but upon her return she was given a new propeller, as her previous one had rapidly deteriorated. Her career was relatively uneventful until the 13th of October of the same year, as she had been very naughty and got grounded. Oh dear. She was eventually pulled off the area where she got grounded and was repaired, but this wouldn't be the last time she'd end up getting grounded, but we'll get to that later. As in 1846 she had her chain drums repaired, and on the 22nd of September she decided to misbehave again and ended up grounding again. But this time she'd end up being stuck for almost a year, as she wouldn't be able to be refloated until the 25th of August 1847. But by the time she was freed, the company that had owned her had gone bust, leading to the Great Britain being sold to the Gibbs and Bright Company for £25,000, beginning a new chapter in the Great Britain's story. Australia. A place where I'm surprised the spiders don't walk down the streets. A place that I wouldn't touch with a 10-inch barge pole. Well, unfortunately for the Great Britain, she wouldn't get a choice, as her new owners wanted to use her as an immigrant ship, as gold was discovered in Victoria back in 1851. And by 1852 the Great Britain had left on her first voyage to Melbourne. This would start her 30-year-long career on this route, but those 30 years weren't uneventful, as in December of 1863, apparently she wrecked. All lives were saved and she herself was salvaged and repaired. Then in 1865, if you were on board, you'd be treated to the sight of an eclipse. And in 1872 a captain of hers died, but things were soon to get worse for the Great Britain. In 1882 the Great Britain was turned into a sailing ship to help transport coal. She would do this for a grand total of 4 years, as in 1886 the Great Britain was sailing to Chicago, no, not the annoyingly catchy musical, #not sponsored, and on her way she caught fire. Then, as if the Great Britain wasn't having a bad enough day already, she ended up grounding in the Falklands. And it was after that that it was discovered that she was damaged beyond economical repair, and I thought that one time a bird took a crap that landed on the dead centre of my head in the middle of a school day was bad. But enough about my misfortunes, as you click to see the story of the Great Britain. And after the Great Britain's grounding, she was sold to the Falkland Islands Company. Under their ownership, she would serve as a storage warehouse, even coaling the fleet of ships that defeated Maximilian von Spree. But alas, she would not serve in this role forever, and by 1937 it was decided that she would be towed to Sparrow Cove and scuttled. But despite this, the Great Britain would still be of some use in World War II, as part of the iron on her hull was salvaged to repair the HMS Exeter. Thankfully though, for the Great Britain, she would not be stuck here forever. In 1970, a salvage operation was funded to recover the Great Britain. The actual operation began in March of 1970, but in April of the same year, a concern was beginning to amount over a crack in the side of the hull, which was soon patched up with mattresses. No, I am not making this up. She was genuinely patched up with mattresses from the locals. And on the 24th of April 1970, she finally left the Falklands on her journey back to Bristol. The most notable part of that journey being when she passed underneath the Clifton Suspension Bridge, another invention created by Brunel. She eventually arrived at her birthplace, the Great Western Dry Docks, where she would undergo a huge restoration and was turned into a museum. But not everything would go to plan, as in 1998 it was discovered that the Great Britain's hull was in a state of rapid deterioration due to the humid condition that her hull was kept in, which led to a glass sheet being placed around her hull to slow down the rate of decay, leading to a nice beautiful sight to get photos from. And that's it. The Great Britain still survives today in Bristol as a museum you can go and visit, which someone who's been there, I do recommend going if you ever get the chance, as she's an important chapter in maritime history. In 1838, Brunel's first ship, called the Great Western, hit the waves. She proved to be quite successful, leading to Brunel building a new revolutionary ship that was to be powered by screw propulsion instead of paddle wheels. Now, if you couldn't tell, Brunel was quite ambitious, leading him to look at his previous two ships and thinking to himself, why don't I build the biggest ship in the world? This led to Brunel beginning to design what would ultimately be his greatest failure. This new ship was to be called the Great Eastern, and even in his early sketches, the Great Eastern was planned to be 6 times the size of the biggest ships in the world at that time. During the planning process, it was decided that the Great Eastern would have 2 methods of propulsion, a screw propeller and a paddle wheel, giving the Great Eastern a service speed of 14 knots. Now, as for a construction process, it was extremely eventful and funny, as on her launch day she slided elegantly down the slipway. Or, well, she would have if she didn't get stuck partway through her launch, killing 2 men. But as if the embarrassment wasn't bad enough, there were many important people within the crowd who watched the hilarious screw-up. So the next time you tear your trousers when you bend over to pick something up or call your teacher Mom, remember this story and think to yourself, well, at least I didn't get stuck on my way down a slipway. Now, enough talking about the Great Eastern's poor first attempt at a launch, as there was a second attempt, which didn't go particularly well as well, thanks to high winds. But by the next day she was thankfully launched, but the nightmare that was the construction process was not over yet, as she had to be fitted out. During this process, the company that owned the Great Eastern went broke, leading to her to be sold to another company, which meant that she would not serve on her planned India to Australia route, but would instead serve on the transatlantic route. But more on that later, as the Great Eastern's life was soon to start off with a bang. Before she could begin her maiden voyage, disaster would strike, as she was hosting some foreign dignitaries when the Great Eastern's funnels decided to try and beat the USA and the USSR in the space race about 90 years early, and blasted off to the moon. Because of this, many people cancelled their passage on her maiden voyage, meaning when she departed Liverpool for the first time, she only had 43 passengers, 8 of which didn't even pay for their passage. Now, thankfully, she had survived her maiden voyage without incident, well, with the exception of the Great Eastern colliding and damaging her wharf upon her arrival. She was then opened to the public for $1 per person, which enraged New Yorkers, and eventually the Great Eastern left on an excursion to Cape May, and at some stage she went to Annapolis, I don't know how you pronounce that, when the then President James Buchanan decided to tour her. In the winter of 1860, the Great Eastern would receive a refit, and some repairs for the damages that occurred in her first year of service. Though this did not go to plan, as she broke free from her moorings and collided with the HMS Blenheim. Then, in 1861, the Great Eastern would find herself in a hurricane, which she would be stuck in for 3 days, during which she would be battered by the waves, and in fact the damage was so bad that rumours began to spread on board about her pumps being overwhelmed, and that it was only a matter of time before she sunk. Thankfully though, these rumours were false. However, that isn't to say that no one got a bit too close for comfort with the ocean, as on the list of damaged parts of the ship was her rudder, which had been bent about 200 degrees and torn up by her own propellers, which could have been a major problem if it wasn't for a guy called Hamilton Towle, who fitted a jury-rigged propeller, making it possible for the Great Eastern to sail to Queenstown, Ireland. Though she was towed in 3 days after her arrival because she was too big. Oh, that poor Great Eastern. In 1862, while she was sailing off near Montauk Point, she collided with a rock that would later be named after her. She survived this and arrived in New York without event. Then, in 1864, she was sold and then chartered out to Cyrus Westfield, where she would go on to lay the first transatlantic cable. She would continue to lay cables with great success. However, despite this, in 1874 a new purpose-built cable-laying ship was well built, removing the need for a ship like the Great Eastern. So after a failed attempt at pushing her back into commercial service, it was decided that she would become a billboard. And no, I am not making that up. Thankfully for the Great Eastern, this embarrassing time wouldn't last forever, and her end was just around the corner. In 1888, she was sold for scrap. Now, you're probably wondering why this is its own section. Well, that's simple. That's because the scrapping process wasn't as easy as other ship scrapping processes. As upon her being sold for scrap, that is scrappable way too many times in one sentence, it was realised that she was too big to be scrapped the normal way. So it was decided that the shipbreakers would become Miley Cyrus and... I came in like a wrecking ball! And for those of you who are still confused on how they scrapped the ship, it was decided that they'd use a wrecking ball. Though not a lot, some part of Brunel's great failure still remain today. For example, part of her funnel now stands in the Great Britain Museum in Bristol. And for the football fans in the audience, one of the Great Eastern's top masts now flies the Liverpool FC flag at the top end of Anfield. And in 2013, a song called The Ballad of the Great Eastern was made. And not only this, but the Great Eastern has been the setting of 3 fiction books in her time, 2 of which are very unoriginal in their names. These books are called A Floating City, and the other 2 are just called Great Eastern. She also appeared in the 2019 game Anno 1800.